And one of the things that anthropologists look at are, as we mentioned, it's not whether it's true or false, but simply what are the social consequences of belief. And one of the things that comes up is the realization that religion serves personal functions, it serves social functions, it serves ecological functions. When it comes to the personal functions, we did say that it helps to answer questions for which we do not have answers. It brings comfort, it brings meaning and purpose to life. Now, there have been some really tough guys who have said religion is for wimps, people who cannot solve their own problems, people who have to call upon some kind of a higher power to solve their problems. I'm a real man, I can solve my own problems. I don't have to rely on Christianity or some kind of fantasy God, etc., etc., etc. And they are deluded individuals who are doing exactly what Satan did in his rebellion against God when he said, I want to be as powerful as God, and I want to be number one in the universe. And there are a lot of human beings who pick up that same attitude. I have no problem addressing the fact that I do not have all of the answers. I do need help when times of stress come, and I find faith in God to be a very powerful attribute to be able to draw upon. As a matter of fact, that study I was referring to a little bit ago regarding what you look like as students when you finished high school and came to Biola, one of the things that they have discovered in doing surveys like this is that students who have a strong faith commitment, who have a strong religious grounding, tend to be better academics, scholars, and students. That overall people with a religious orientation make for better scholarship. Interesting finding. Well, it also impacts society, it impacts ecology, and I concluded by saying none of these sociological, anthropological explanations for human religious behavior addresses the deep longing for individuals. And I'm convinced that the reason for this is because we were created in the image of God. And because we were created in the image of God, we have, and I quoted Rene Pascal on this one, there is a God-shaped vacuum in the heart of every one of us, and until God himself fills it, nothing can fill that vacuum. All right, we're going to move on now to an entirely different subject within the anthropological study of religion, and that is the anthropological use of the word cult. Now, around here, whenever you hear the word cult, because of our religious orientation, because we've got a Talbot School of Theology, whenever we talk about cult around Biola, we are talking about a variation of Christianity away from orthodoxy. So any variation from Orthodox Christianity is defined as a cult. So you will find actually a class taught around here, you know, American cults. And in that study of American cults, you will have discussions regarding Jehovah's Witnesses, Mormons, perhaps even Seventh-day Adventists, although they've tried very hard to be identified with orthodoxy. There's a variation of Orthodox Christianity that you may not have heard of called modalism. And modalism is becoming very, very popular in certain churches with a Pentecostal bent. And in modalism, they deny the existence of the Orthodox belief in the Trinity. So we use that term cult. Unfortunately, that religious use of the word cult is not the same as the social science use of the word cult. Now, I wish that these two disciplines didn't have such a conflict of terms, but they're there. We got to live with them. In your textbook, there is a whole section on the discussion of religious cults. And when they talk about a cult, they're not talking about a variation from orthodoxy. What they're talking about is a cult, in the sociological sense of the term, is any organized form of religious belief. All right? Any organized system of religious belief is called a cult. There's no right, wrong comparison. It just, that's what it is. So, if you have any organized form of religious belief, then what kinds of organized systems of religious belief do you have? And here again, the anthropologists have come up with some very distinct categories. First, they have what they call individualistic cults. This is a system of organized belief in which personal responsibility is very important. It's the highest form of organizing principle. Personal responsibility. So individualistic cults are the kind of thing that you see in the Old Testament when Abraham is the high priest of his family. He offers sacrifices. He offers sacrifices for himself and his family, nobody else. It's the same thing that you see in the book of Job. Job, every day, prays to God on behalf of his entire family. He is the high priest of his family. It is a system in which you are responsible for your own spiritual well-being, or at least the spiritual well-being of your family. This was very popular in North American cultures, where individuals had to go off on vision quest. They had to find their own totemic spirit. They had to find their own guiding spirit. Now, do I dare ask you a question? How many of you saw that film, Dances with Wolves? Okay, a fair few of you saw Dances with Wolves. Do you remember where he, the American soldier, finally gets invited to come to the camp of the Lakota people with whom he's making contact? He is sitting in the teepee and he is talking with the head religious leader and political leader of that group, and he's got his adopted daughter, who was a captive American woman, acting as translator, and so they're talking, and she's trying to remember the English words, and he's talking through her, and one of the things that he says to this man is, why are you so interested in talking with me? And he says something about my philosophy, my approach has been framed, has been prompted by my guiding spirit, my animal spirit. And then the camera pans up to the top of the teepee, and there's something up there. What was that something? Do any of you remember the scene? Now, this is absolutely essential to understanding the whole story. and you missed it. You people don't know how to watch movies. You're watching for the love scenes. You're watching for the shooting scenes. You're not watching for the philosophical meanings behind them. It shoots up there, and there is a stuffed crow up there. The crow is his totemic spirit. The crow is his guiding spirit. When he was a young man, he went off and did a vision quest. His vision quest was to try to find how he could relate to the spirit world and who would be the mediator between him and the spirit world. And the crow appeared to him in his vision quest, and this became then his guiding spirit. Many people in individualistic and shamanic, we'll talk about that in a few minutes, shamanic cults want a guiding spirit. So he's got it. He's listening to that spirit. It's telling him, make contact with these white people, find out about them. There's going to be more of them coming. We've got to learn to live with them. So start working with this man. Develop a trust bond with him. And thus begins the whole story of Dances with Wolves. Individualistic cults. There's what we also call shamanistic cults. And in shamanistic cults, we start getting specialists emerging from the culture. In shamanistic cultures, specialists who will perform healing rituals, who will do divination rituals, who will do curses or stop curses. These Native Americans bounce between individualistic cults and shamanistic cults depending upon the particular tribe. But in shamanism, you have people who have special abilities to do healing rituals. Now, I've just gotten through reading a master's level thesis of one of our graduating students, and she looked at religious practitioners in a Himalayan kingdom. And she discovered there were a number of religious practitioners there. There were Buddhist monks. There were at least two kinds of Buddhist monks. Then there were magicians who could do black magic. There were what she called jumping doctors. These were people who could entertain the spirits. And then there were shamans. And she identified all of these various kinds of people. When you were sick, you called upon a shaman. You did not call upon a magician. You did not call upon a monk. You called upon a shaman. So shamanistic cults, these are people who are specialists in praying and bringing healing to people. Shamanistic cults are prevalent all over the world, even to today. Then there's what we call communal cults. Again, using this sociological definition of the word cult. And in communal cults, you have extended families and communities will engage in the rituals. And one of the primary sources of these rituals will be ancestral worship. Communal cults are very typical in, for instance, Japan with Shinto. Shinto is basically an ancestral worship cult, if we can use that phrase. It's an ancestral worship cult. The Shinto priest will come, will bless a house, bless a family, bless an individual, come for special occasions, take care of all kinds of rituals that will ensure that the family and the ancestors are in good, positive relationships. These same priests or monks will also come do ceremonies to determine whether there is feng shui over a house. You would never think about building a new building without checking to find out whether it is an auspicious place to build and where you should place the doors. Now, there's this marvelous story that comes out of Chinatown in San Francisco. And a number of years ago, a bank wanted to build a brand new bank in San Francisco. And so they ordered up all kinds of marble from China. And after due process of time, the marble arrived and came to the construction site. and they unpacked all the marble, only to discover that the marble was all marked with Chinese writing telling where to place it. You know, place this piece next to this piece, because it had all been hewn to be matching and to fit in certain parts of the structure. And none of the American contractors knew how to read Chinese, didn't know how to place the marble. So they went to the Chinese community in San Francisco and asked them, look, would you come read the Chinese markings on it? Oh, he said, yeah, you got to put us on the payroll, though. Okay, we'll put you on the payroll. You come and read the Chinese markings, tell us, you know, what's up, what's down, where it goes. And they said, oh, but before we do that, we've got to have a feng shui person come and determine whether this is an auspicious place for a bank. And they said, oh, come on, give us a break. You know, we don't do that in America. Well, we won't translate for you if you don't get a feng shui person in there. Okay, bring your feng shui guy by. So he checked it all out, and the feng shui specialist said, oh, this is not a good place to build a bank. It's a horrible place to build a bank. Build the bank across the street. That's a good place to build a bank. And they said, no, we're building it here. They said, well, we don't want anything to do with this. So they all took off. Wouldn't translate well, they finally found somebody that would translate for them, and the bank was built. Not too much later, another bank built right across the street at this new location. And when they built the new bank, guess what? All of Chinatown said that's where we're going to bank because it's got good feng shui. It's going to be a successful bank. That'll be the bank for all of us Chinese people. So all of these people from Chinatown came and opened up accounts in that new bank. As a matter of fact, the line was so long, it went 2 blocks out the front door of people coming to open up accounts in the new bank. So the bank got off to a roaring start, and then came the great San Francisco earthquake. Then came the bank crash. Guess what? The bank with good feng shui survived the earthquake, and it also survived the bank crash. Because, you see, when everybody started to panic, they went rushing to the banks to get their money out. But the Chinese said, oh, we don't need to worry. Our bank's not going to fail. So the Chinese did not contribute to the run on the banks, did not draw their money out, allowed that bank to survive that day, and it was one of the few banks to get through the Great Depression. Go figure. Anyway, communal cults. Communal cults are part of the way religions organize themselves. The last category is what we call ecclesiastical cults. And in ecclesiastical cults, you have specialization taking over. You get the introduction of a formal priesthood. A formal priesthood. This is what happens in Israel. Israel moves from individualistic cults in the time of Job up to communal cults where families are doing their things together. And then you move up to ecclesiastical cults where you have formal priesthood, people who are set aside This is their job. This is this is how they make their living. They will become priests. They will study. They will conduct rituals. They will engage in sacrifices. They will take care of the needs of the people, usually in some kind of a temple location. So the difference, for instance, between the priest in Leviticus is the priest in Leviticus will offer up sacrifices every day at the altar. Shamans would not do that. As a matter of fact, what happens in Israel is the role of shaman, well, let's put it this way, the role of healing gets divided between the priest who look for ritual cleansing. The priests do not really heal people. The people who really heal people in Israel are the prophets. And prophets are the ones who go around healing people. And once they've healed people, then the people go to the priest to get verified as being pure again or healed. So, there's some variations to all of this, but that is basically how it categorizes out. So ecclesiastical cults. Now, quite frankly, what you have now is in America, we have people who are in full-time ministry. If you've got a pastor in your church, and if he lives off of the offerings from the church, if he spends all of his time ministering to the members of the congregation, preparing sermons, that's part of an ecclesiastical cult. It is organized around a place of worship and a person who leads that place of worship. Shamanism, now you do it in the home, you do it out in the bush, you do it wherever is the most convenient place. All right, we now need to move on to what happens about being a Christian anthropologist. And Christian anthropologists, I have suggested, have their own set of questions. How does human sin impact religion? And here we're going to turn to Romans 1:21 through 23. Because there, the Apostle Paul describes for us how sin affects religion. He says, humanity became vain in their imagination. In other words, we began to create gods in the image that we wanted. We wanted them to serve us. Rather than us serving God, we wanted gods who would serve us. Furthermore, our foolish hearts were darkened. We wanted to be able to continue to hold on to our own desires, even if they were sinful or selfish. Hearts were darkened. Thirdly, we changed the glory of God from being Creator, Master, Lord of the universe, to being just another force or power or influence in nature. We began to worship the creature, not the Creator. And if you will notice that in the Old Testament, you get all of these representations of God in the form of creatures. You have the fish goddess. You have the bull goddess. You go to Ephesus and you see the image of God as a female, a very powerful female, a female with multiple rows of breasts so that she can nourish many, many children. It becomes a fertility goddess. And you worship this goddess by coming into the temple and having sex with a temple prostitute. And it's all about fertility and good luck and etc. All of a sudden now, our creatures are the image of our Creator. Now, what do we do about these images? What do we do about the manner in which we have basically changed the image of God? We have pandered to our own selfish desires. We have become ignorant regarding God and His claims. How do we handle all of them? Now, we've gone through several phases as Christians. There was a phase in which we said absolutely nothing good can come out of pagan religions. Absolutely nothing good can be found outside of the Scriptures. There was a total rejection of anything that was not in the Bible. That was a bit harsh. We've changed things a little bit. I would suggest instead that all religions have an element of truth in their beliefs. Now, why do I say that? Because I'm convinced that God did not leave Himself without a testimony. That the true nature of God is evident both internally and in nature. So, we can look at other religions and see some element of truth there that can begin to point them then toward the truth of God's self-revelation. The problem is, human sin always leads to what we call the cultural captivity of God. Every culture, and this is an important conclusion, every culture seeks to diminish God so that He becomes their own tribal or cultural God. We would desire nothing more than to say, God is not an Englishman. God is an American. And everything that we Americans do is a perfect replica of what God is like. We want to captivate the Bible, its teaching, and the work of God, and make it an expression of American hegemony in the world today. And this cultural captivity of the Christian faith plagued Germany, Holland, Italy, England, and the United States. Every time one of these powers rose in power and authority, they claimed that God, as they understood it, was the truest understanding of who God is. And so we have what we now call the cultural captivity of God. And one of the biggest tasks facing us today in a generation of increased globalization is to release God from being a captive of American culture to becoming truly God of all nations. So the task before your generation is to seek the bronze of any cultural captivity, to be able to represent Christ, to be able to represent God in all of the wonder and glory of His self-revelation in the Scriptures. This will require patience, dialogue, and the willingness to engage in the perspectives toward the world, toward a God that comes from other cultures. Well, let's move on. How does Satan impact religion? I happen to believe that Satan is a very real creature. I believe he was a fallen angel. I suspect that he was one of the highest of the angels before his fall. I think he's busy in this creation. I believe that behind all of the false worship, Satan is the recipient of that false worship. So when people worship one of their idols, when people worship their nature spirits, when people worship their ancestors, in point of fact, they are worshiping Satan. and he's quite happy to receive their worship. I believe that Satan also energizes acts of evil and acts of magic. Are you aware that people from other religions believe that they can heal people, that they can perform miracles? I have read countless miracle stories of priests, monks, and imams, if you would, from other religions who claimed that God honored their prayers and performed a miracle for them. Now, how do we explain that? Now, let me just give you an illustration. The Mormons left the Midwest because they were being persecuted by Christians. So they took off, they went on their wagons, they went up over the mountains, and they finally found the Great Salt Lake. They settled in there. They planted their crops. They started to thrive. And then what happened? A horde of locusts came and threatened to eat all of their ready-to-harvest crops. The Mormons were facing devastation and certain death with the destruction of their crops. They could not stop the locusts. And they cried out to God. And what happened? Do you know the Mormon story? Seagulls, thousands of seagulls flew in and began to eat the locusts, the grasshoppers. And the crop was saved, and the people lived. And as a consequence, if you go to Salt Lake City today, you can still see on top of the temple the image of Moroni, the angel that brought the Book of Mormon to Joseph Smith. But you will also see on top of a huge column a seagull. The Mormons are convinced that God endorsed their faith by answering their prayer and sending the seagulls to save their lives. Now, does God approve of Mormonism? Should we all become Mormons because the seagulls saved them? No. Does a miracle validate an ideology or a doctrine? That's one of the problems we're going to run into. You know what? There are a lot of ways to interpret miracles, healings, unusual experiences. In my own mind, without attacking Mormonism, please understand, I am not attacking Mormonism. That's the job of another class, of another, that's the job of theologians, and that's not my job. But I do want to point out, I believe in God's common grace. God loves all people, and He causes the rain to fall on both the good and the evil. And God, in order to save people from an untimely, uncertain demise, in order to give them more time to come to faith, to come to repentance, God will do marvelous things. Common grace, I believe, prompted God to save the lives of all of these men, women, and children who were so desperately trying to stay alive. I would make the same conclusion regarding the tsunami that saved the Japanese people. We all know what a tsunami is. We've just had some recently. But the very term tsunami, do you know what tsunami means? Are you just shy or ignorant? Oh, I shouldn't ask that. That's embarrassing. Tsunami means divine wind. It's a wind from God. When did that first come into existence? You know what? The Mongolian troops had marched down into Korea. And the Mongolian troops from North Korea, or from Korea period, decided that they wanted to attack Japan, and Korea was the closest landmass to Japan. So they built a huge navy of ships, and the entire Mongol army and its cavalry got on these ships and set out to sail for Japan. And they were going to devastate the people. Thousands, hundreds of thousands of people would have died if the Mongol army had landed on Japan's soil. The people stood there with pitchforks to try to hold off the invading Mongol army, when all of a sudden there was a tsunami that swept down through the sea and swamped the ships, and not one Mongol ship was able to safely arrive on Japanese soil. And the few survivors who managed to make it to Japanese soil were quickly dispatched by people on the beaches. Japan was saved from a Mongol invasion by an act of God. And the Japanese have always remembered that. Now, they don't know about God. They had no idea who God was. This was a long time before missionaries ever showed up to tell them about God. But God was preserving this people so that they might one day hear. Do you know a recent story that just came out of the last tsunami? Do you know that after that first tsunami, that the ancestors actually built places up on the mountains where they said, do not build any homes below or at a lower altitude than this stone, because it will be an offense to the ancestors. And they built those all along the coast, and people ignored it. Oh, that was such a long time ago. That was such a superstition. In point of fact, they were tsunami markers that said, this is where the tsunami will come if it comes again. Don't build down here. Well, I'm convinced that God in His mercy sometimes does marvelous things for people in order to preserve life, because God gets no joy out of killing people. All right? So, Satan, he's out there. He's energizing evil. He's causing miracles to happen to make people believe in the lie. Satan makes divination methods prove true in order to empower local magicians. If he can delude people into false worship, he will energize them to do things that appear to be good, but in point of fact are part of a whole web of deception. Satan blinds people to the truth. And so we have false doctrines. We have false ideas. We have people who cannot understand the scriptures. In spite of all of Satan's activities, though, I am convinced that the power of Jesus Christ is available to every believer for the tearing down of every area of Satan's influence. I am 100% committed to the power of God to triumph over whatever Satan throws at us. As a matter of fact, in anthropological or in missiological circles, we have a phrase called power encounters. And in power encounters, the power of God is pitted against the power of spirits, demonic attacks. This dissertation, or this thesis I was telling you about earlier on the Himalayan kingdom, the man who is the feature of this particular case study tells about how he came to an awareness of the power of God as being greater than the power of a dragon spirit that lives in this area or believed to live in that area, and how through the power of Jesus' name, people have been set free from the power of the dragon spirit. Classic power encounter stuff. All right? We do not go out in fear or in temerity. We go out in the name and the power of Jesus Christ. Well, one last topic before we bring it to a roaring conclusion. One of the things that I discovered early was anthropologists do not like missionaries. Missionaries don't like anthropologists. It is a bitter feud between kissing cousins, if you would, because both groups of people love people, want the best for them, but differ on what is best for them. Share the gospel or let them live in their chosen state. And one of the things that has come up has been an accusation by anthropologists that missionaries destroy cultures. Now, do you want to know something? That's a hard accusation to deny, because all too often missionaries did seek to destroy cultures. They did seek to destroy everything that they thought was evil. They did try to form cultures into an image of what their own home country was like the early missionaries who went to Hawaii and saw all these Hawaiian women running around with grass skirts and no tops. Oh, well, that's terrible. I mean, decent women don't show their breasts to men. So we've got to put dresses on all these women. We got to teach them how to be modest. So the first missionaries wrote back to their churches in New England, and they said, look, we need dresses for the women so they can become modest Christian women. We've got to put clothes on them. So make us some dresses. And they said, well, what kind of dresses will we make? Well, just make a one size fits all. So the women in New England designed a one-size-fits-all dress that we know today as a muumuu. Do you know what a muumuu is? It's one of these dresses you just pull over your head, and it's just nice and flowy, short sleeve normally. It's the kind of dress you see all through Hawaii now. It's a pullover dress, and it was great. Now they've got a dress that will cover them, from neck to knees. Oh, so excited. So whenever anybody became a Christian, got baptized, they got a free muumuu. Hey, look at how fast, how much progress we're making here. There was just one problem. Nursing mothers had a problem with those muumuus because baby got hungry and needed to feed. You either got to stretch the neck out in order to pop out, whatever, or if you didn't want to stretch, you just pull the darn thing up. Well, that wasn't a very good answer. So they struggled with it for a while. Finally, nursing mothers came up with a better answer. Oh, we love the dress. It protects us from the sun and from the bugs and everything, but we still need to have access for a baby, so we'll just cut a hole, two of them right here. And we'll just let the breast hang out, and the baby can have ready access anytime it wants. Poor missionaries, they were struggling. But they did. They often sought to introduce new changes that would bring them into conformity with American or English standards of modesty and of behavior. And they did do horrible, destructive things. They did try to tear down any vestige of pagan influence on the culture. And all we could do is repent of that. 18th and 19th century missionaries screwed up. We have to say guilty as charged. But the worst guilt comes not from saying that or admitting we did something wrong in the past. The bigger guilt and shame comes if we continue those practices. And so one of the things we've tried to do is to learn to adjust our missionary methods to the realities that come from being culturally sensitive and biblically responsible. And that's where anthropology comes in. Because for the last 60, 75 years maybe, anthropology has begun to inform missionary strategies so that we do not destroy cultures. If you want to criticize missionaries for destroying cultures, study the 19th century, the 18th century. Don't go looking at missionaries today unless they're perpetrating the bad practices of the past. Because you see, answering the questions, do missionaries destroy cultures? We really have to say it really depends upon their strategies. And there are three strategies that we want to look at. First, and this has been a very popular strategy, you have to civilize people before you can evangelize them. Civilize, then evangelize. So you go into an area and you try to teach them a whole new way of life. Now, one of the classic examples of missions might be exemplified in the work of David Livingstone. Now, David Livingstone was a great explorer, a marvelous Christian, and actually a missionary. And he went up into the heart of Africa looking for people, groups to present the gospel to. He was first and foremost a missionary. He came back from his first travels into the interior of Africa, and he reported to the British Parliament, listen, there are thousands of people, hundreds of thousands of people who live there, and two evils are taking place. First of all, the Germans want to take over East Africa, and we don't want them to have it. We want Britain to have it. Secondly, Muslim slavers are active there. They go in, they capture people, they bring them through the slave routes out to the coast of East Africa, put them on ships, and send them then off to the Middle East or to China or to other parts of the world as slaves. We've got to stop the slave trade, and we've got to stop the Germans. So, British Parliament approved the Livingstonia mission to begin work in East Africa. He went back. He was given a huge tract of land. Hundreds of thousands of acres of African territory were given to the Livingstonia mission. Once they were granted that land, then British troops came in, told the Germans, butt out, and then began to attack the Muslim slavers who were capturing people from the interior. They would bring them onto the coast. They would be met by British Marines. The captives would be set free. There was just one problem. These freed slaves could not get back home. It was hundreds of miles into the interior. So they would bring those British or those freed slaves and give them to David Livingstone. And David Livingstone's job was to house them and train them to be good Christians. You know what the name of his mission was? The Gospel and Cotton Mission. Because his job was to teach all of these new freed slaves how to grow cotton. Acres and acres of cotton that could then be harvested, bundled up, put on ships, sent back to England. It becomes then a way of paying for the mission, paying for the colonial support of that part of East Africa, and it was a way to have gainful employment for these freed slaves. Not a half bad idea. The only problem was all these slaves now look to David Livingstone. What are we going to do? Well, first of all, we got to give you an education, so he started schools. Secondly, we got to have a house for you. Let's build a nice, simple English-style house for you. Secondly, we got to put clothes on you, so we'll give you English-style clothes. And then, oh, every one of you guys need a wife. Okay, let's set up a Christian marriage. Okay, you're married to him. Come on, let's get married before God. Started setting up families and developed Christian communities modeled after English villages. And the whole idea was, as you civilize them, you open up their minds to a desire for new concepts. People cannot really understand the concept of the Trinity. People cannot really understand the concept of God. People cannot really understand the Bible until they've been civilized, taught how to read, behave, not act like savages. Civilize them, then evangelize them. There is a marvelous movie that you can see over in the library called Okamo is My Town. It's the story of a Roman Catholic mission in South America, in the Orinoco River region. And one of the things that the Roman Catholic priest says, this generation will never understand God's plan of salvation. It's too complicated for their simple minds. But God understands that. We are not about ready to baptize any of the adults here. What we're going to do is we're going to train this young generation of children so that when they become adults, we can baptize them, because then they'll know enough to be able to become Christians. Civilization and education now become linked with understanding the gospel. So you have to civilize, then evangelize. A group of evangelical missionaries responded quite negatively to that approach and said, no way. We are simply going to go out and preach the gospel. We're going to preach Jesus Christ, crucified, risen, and coming again, nothing else. We're not going to do anything to change their culture. We're just going to preach the gospel. Well, that sounds great, but it doesn't work. Because once you accept Jesus Christ, your values change. And once your values change, the things that you invest your life into change. You begin to look at life differently. You evangelize, then civilize. Missionaries tried to stay free and neutral of any political implications, and they discovered that it does not work well. The third approach that we've begun to experiment with in the latter part of the 20th century and now into the 21st century is to evangelize people without destroying their cultures, but with a very definite intention of transforming them. Evangelize and transform. That's the methodology that we advocate today. What does transforming a culture look like? I went into Irian Jaya in the mid-1960s. We had 10,000 people in our valley. They all wanted to become Christians. They said, what do we need to do to become Christians? Believe in Jesus Christ. Okay, we believe. Now what? Who can we marry? What about Bridewell? What about our leaders? What about guys who have got multiple wives? How should we live? Should we reorganize our communities? All kinds of problems began to emerge in respect to what they should do. Should we put clothes on them? We decided that we would, first of all, not require them to put clothes on. For the first 20 years of their becoming Christians, pastors still stood up in front of the congregation with hardly a stitch of clothing on them to preach, because we did not require pastors to be clothed any differently than the rest of the members of the community. Women were baptized in grass skirts, not in nice baptismal gowns or even with free t-shirts. We did not make a big change there. We did not force them to change their names. This is one of the things that early missionaries did. Oh, your name's Kugiwatanban? Oh yeah, we're going to call you Matthew. That's a good biblical name. They changed the names of people, gave them Christian names. We didn't do any of that. We did not change anything that did not have to be changed in order to pursue righteousness. But there were a number of things that did have to change. And one of the big ones was the need for peace. The need for a new way to resolve decades of conflict.
Biola University offers a variety of biblically centered degree programs, ranging from business to ministry to the arts and sciences. Visit biola.edu to find out how Biola could make a difference in your life.